Dr. Amy Porter received her PhD in history from Southern Methodist University in 2004 and her BA in history and Spanish from Austin College. She teaches early Americana, Texas history, the Spanish borderlands, and the American West. That's impressive. She is faculty co-advisor for the History Club with chapter affiliates of the Walter Prescott Webb Historical Society. She is a published author of a book from 2015 called Their Lives, Their Wills, The Women of the Borderlands from 1750 to 1846. Her research interests are the Spanish colonial borderlands history, early U.S. history, women's history, and Texas history. Dr. Amy Porter, and I can't remember what the M is for, and I'm not going to look it up. But Dr. Porter is our guest this evening to talk to us about women in early San Antonio, early Daviess County history.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for inviting me to speak today. This is an exciting time with the tricentennial here upon us. As you heard from the introduction, my research on women in the Spanish borderlands, it has always included the San Antonio area, but with the tricentennial, I've had the opportunity to dive much deeper into Bear itself and focus on this area. Before, I was looking also at New Mexico and northern Mexico, and I love that research, but it's fun to have this really specific focus as well. And I have to say, as I go around and I give talks on this topic or similar topics, one thing I learn is that I always meet people who have done their family history, which is absolutely wonderful and really important. And I will mention names at times in my research, and somebody will come up to me after and say, you know, I'm related to that person, and they have the entire family history and genealogy. And it's wonderful for me because I don't do that research in my work. The way I approach my work, I look at documents and I look for patterns that help explain sort of the broader experiences of people in this place in the Spanish colonial period. So that's sort of what I wanted to talk to you all about today. And also, just to say more broadly, I think that it's important as we think about this tricentennial that we not focus exclusively on San Antonio or the city of San Antonio. When we think about the Spanish founding of the settlement in 1718, we're talking about the establishment of missions and presidial communities and ranches. And those ranches are very different in some ways than the ranches we have today. There weren't fences. When the missionaries arrived, when the presidial soldiers arrived, there were already pretty large herds of feral cattle. And without fences, those cattle go all over the place. So you can say that this piece of land along the San Antonio River belongs to Mission San Jose, but those cattle don't stay put, right? They're expanding all over the area. And very soon, people who lived all over this area, civil settlers who would get the land grants and would take over that land, would engage in ranching. And of course, the cattle also became important resources for Indians in the area. And those cattle would be used in different ways. So I appreciate that you all are involved in the tricentennial and so many other communities. I feel like, I'm not sure what will happen, but when we get to 1731, there'll be another celebration in the city with the arrival of the Canary Islanders, and sort of the more formal founding of the Villa San Fernando de Bejar, but we'll have to wait for 2031 to see what the city plans for that. So this evening, I want to look specifically at the stories of women and their experiences, because I think it's really easy to look at this history and to think of it in almost this masculine way. What I've already told you all. Who did I mention? The missionaries, the presidial soldiers. So right away what comes to mind are the men, but they're not coming here by themselves. The presidial soldiers, when they arrive, many of them bring families with them. There are also artisans and craftsmen who come with that community, and they have families. So that by 1730, if we look at Bejar, there's about 40 married couples in the area. I mean, at the beginning, it's very, very small. The other thing to keep in mind are in the mission communities. Yes, the missionaries will be in charge of the operations, but the people who live there, they're families as well. They're men, there's women, there's children. There was a big focus on bringing children into the missions. They were viewed as those who were more easy to convert, right? Their minds hadn't been shaped necessarily, their minds hadn't been made up. So right from the beginning, I think we need to sort of think differently about how we see the early community. And well, I'm going to focus on the Spanish women. I just want to say a word about when you do early history, when you do colonial history, it's always important to acknowledge the Native American people. In this area, there's evidence of human occupation dating back 10,000 years. So I certainly don't want to make it seem like the Spanish showed up and they're the first people here. Not too far from here, well, let me start with this. Is anybody an archaeologist or?
I want to be.
I do too. Okay, I love archaeology. So for archaeologists, there's a database that they have access to where they can see the important sites that have been explored throughout the area. And those of us don't have access to it. I think there's concern that if everybody knew about these sites, they could be looted. So some of the sites are more or less kept secret, or their exact location is not exactly explained. I've seen the maps on occasion, and there are a huge number of sites in this area. But one that we do know a lot about, it's not that far from here, really. It's on the land of the Land Heritage Institute, which is it's next to the Toyota plant, sort of on the other side of the Toyota plant, right along the Medina River. So if you haven't been out there, you should go. It's amazing, and they have a really impressive herd of longhorn cattle. But archaeologists have been working on that site, the Richard Bean site, for quite a while. They keep coming back year after year, and they have found a mastodon bone that was worked by humans, for example. So we have this very long history. So I just want to mention that to start off with. Thinking about the arrival of the Spanish and how they will attempt to establish their community in this area, women are going to play a really important role in this. For the Spanish, they have certain goals. They want to establish these missions. They want to convert Indians to Christianity. They believe wholeheartedly that this is an important role that they play in the world, that they are saving people, that they are helping people. But they also want to settle the area, and you can do that through missionization. You can work with the native people in the area. Once they're converted, the missions become secularized, which is what happened in the area, and the people there become citizens of Spain, or of New Spain. So they become part of the community, they become the settlers. The other thing to do is to get people to move to the frontier, which happens to be very challenging in the San Antonio area. People don't want to come, and that's why Canary Islanders will be recruited. But for the Spanish, they need to get families there. That's going to be the mark of permanency. So long as you have the mission communities and then the presidial soldiers, yes, some of those presidial soldiers are married. Some of them are not, though. You have an unequal gender ratio. When you have more men than women in a settlement, it's not a permanent settlement. Generally, when it becomes permanent, you see an equal ratio of men to women, or more women than men. But the numbers are quite close. So I'll explain more about that in just a minute. The Canary Islanders will arrive in the 1730s. Initially, there are efforts to bring, they thought maybe we can bring 200 families and really establish this frontier. And I should say this, one of the reasons the Spanish are interested at this point in settling this area, it's not because they found gold, because they certainly didn't. When Coronado explored the area, in the 1540s, he did not find the wealth that he was looking for, the Spanish were looking for. What it is the threat of European encroachment, especially the French in Louisiana. So the Spanish see this area as a buffer, and they want to protect their valuable silver mines in northern Mexico. And then some of the Indians really start to become a threat. It starts off initially in northern Mexico with a group of Indians called the Chichimecas, who the Spanish fought for over 100 years, had the hardest time defeating, and they threatened those silver mines. Once Europeans arrived in the Americas and horses got loose, you of course have Native American groups, Apaches, and then in particular the Comanches, who by 1730s, certainly the 1740s, are a major, major threat. In this area, they're going to be the most powerful force. So some of those larger Native American groups become a threat to the Spanish colonies as well. So the Spanish think if they can recruit these families to come and settle in this area, that will jumpstart San Antonio, or I should say San Fernando de Bejar. And things don't go quite as well as planned. They end up with 15 families. There's a 16th family. It's actually single men that they group together and say is the 16th family. And one of the things we see right away with the Canary Islanders, of course, there's women who are coming. 2 of those women are widowed. One of them has a child on the journey. These women have young children, they have several children, and they're granted land. So right from the beginning, you have women, landholders, heads of household in this community. It shouldn't be a surprise, but I still think it's important to point out because sometimes we don't think of that automatically. Why this is important, one of the points I'm going to make is that women will be absolutely critical in the development of this community, largely because of 2 things. One, the rates of widowhood, and the other will be the property rights that the Spanish give women. So, the widowhood. Generally speaking, in the early 1700s, actually you can say throughout the entire Spanish colonial period, this is a really dangerous place to live. Life expectancy is around 32 years of age throughout the entire period. There's really high infant mortality rates, so that's what brings down that age. Because if you look at the census records, and those records are rather spotty, but they're more consistent by the late 1700s, early 1800s, you'll see several people who are very advanced in age. But if you look at other types of documents, burial records, for example, you will see very high rates of infant mortality, and that helps to explain that rate. There's epidemic disease. Smallpox epidemics sweeping through the area. There's a big one in 1785, for example. There aren't doctors in the area. Most people seek medical care from curanderos, people, often Native Americans who have medicinal knowledge or have passed it on to other people in the community. Indian raids are a persistent problem throughout the colonial period. And if you're talking about a community where you have presidial soldiers and one of their primary responsibilities is to protect the settlements from Indian raids, that's dangerous work in and of itself. So all of these things mean life is difficult and high mortality rates. For women, they tend to be younger at the age of marriage than men. So if they survive childbirth, they're likely to outlive their husbands. So if we look at the numbers of men who are widowed, the numbers of women, there are more women who are surviving their husbands despite the dangers of childbirth. Many of them remarry, but nonetheless, you still see significant numbers of widows who own property and sometimes operate ranches and businesses in Spanish San Antonio. So a lot of this comes from some of the research I did for my book. And something I should point out, in doing this type of research, historians like to use certain types of documents. We like to find diaries, we like to find letters, the type of things where people are writing and talking about their feelings and why they made these decisions. And we pretty much have none of that from this period of time, especially from the women. So we have to use different types of documents. Literacy rates were low by our modern standards. This is not meant to say these are uneducated people by any means. I think there are very few places in the world at the time that have high literacy rates, though one of them happens to be the Puritan communities of the British colonies. because there was such an emphasis amongst that community in reading the Bible. Individuals need to read the Bible, so they taught children to read at a young age, and that was unusual in the world. So what we're talking about in this area amongst men, maybe 1/3 of the population, adult male population, could read and write, and we really don't know with the women. When I looked at wills, those are the type of documents I depended on the most for my research. At the end of the will, the person has the opportunity to sign their name. The women in San Antonio, I did not have one who signed her name. So, but it's hard to say why. They would either say, I did not sign because I do not know how, or I did not sign because I could not sign my name. And early in the will, the person will say if they are sick or injured or an advanced age, so there might be another reason they weren't able to sign it. I can't say based on that language necessarily, but that gives you an idea of some of the challenges of doing this type of work. So we have to depend on government documents, the wills that I talked about, property records, and archaeology. The work of archaeologists becomes very important in uncovering these stories here. So when it comes to the widows, those type of documents that I mentioned, you can see them in the census records. If you search, if any of you all are interested in this type of research, this is a lot of fun, I think. You can go online, University of Texas, the Briscoe Center. If you look up Bear Archives Online, you can search the documents that have been posted online, transcribed, translated in many cases. They're getting, I think they're in the 1790s. So if you want to look at anything after that, you have to go to Austin to do that right now, but they're still working on this project. If you put in census and you pull any census and just look at one page, just glance at it, you will see a lot of widows. Many of whom are young and many of whom have young children. But I would say that's not the entire story, because if you look at the documents I looked at with the wills, the women will say how many times they've been married. So a woman who might show up in the census as married in her will might say, that was my second husband. So it's not necessarily telling the entire story. The other part of this, besides widowhood, are the property rights. So you all might know this already, but I still think it's important to point out. Under Spanish law, women could own property. They could own property before they were married. They could bring property into a marriage and it remained their own. There were community property laws so that everything the couple earned belonged to them equally. There's not really divorce. When we think of community property today, we think about divorce. This doesn't have anything to do with divorce. Divorces were pretty much not allowed. And this was the realm of the church. If the church intervened in a case, and abuse, for example, was found to be so severe that the couple was allowed to separate, neither person could remarry until their spouse died. So it's not even divorce as we think about it today. It has more to do with ideas about property and ideas about marriage as a partnership, an economic partnership in many ways. And it would have implications for inheritance too, when somebody remarries, for example. The other piece of this, inheritance. So there's no primogeniture like you would see in the British colonies, if I can make that comparison. So you don't have the eldest son inheriting all the property. There are laws on the books that say one heir can inherit no more than 1/3 to 1/5 of the estate. So 1/3 of the estate could be a lot of it if there's 6 children, but nonetheless, that means that the property is distributed fairly equally, and in fact, that's what I find in my research with the wills. Fairly equal inheritance amongst all children, whether they be sons or daughters. There were dowries. Dowry is a gift to the couple when they get married, but in reality, it comes from the woman's family, and the property is really that of the woman. Her husband cannot sell it without her consent. So these are really strong property rights. They come from Roman law. There are similar property rights under Dutch law, if we were to look at the brief colony of Dutch New York, or if we look at the French, it's fairly similar too, in Louisiana, for example. the ones who have different laws are the British. And I think that's why we sort of, when we think about women during this time, we tend to think, oh, they didn't have any property. Because we tend to think of the British 13 colonies as sort of the norm, as establishing the basis for law, or we don't think about it deeply to say, oh, there's different legal systems in place necessarily. And this helps explain a lot, and this gets into a totally different period of time. But if we were to look at the transition from Spanish, well, I'd say the Mexican period to the Republic of Texas, and then Texas being part of the United States, there's some loss of property rights for women, but there's also a lot of persistence from those Spanish laws. And one of the places we see that is with community property, right? So that's why Texas is a community property state. It comes from Spanish law. So I think it's interesting anyways, but it's really important for this period of time. So what that means is that women could be heads of household. They could be, and they were, property owners. And in some cases, really significant property owners. Households. What did the households look like during this period of time? Despite those really strong property laws, this is a patriarchal society. So what you have are households headed by men. The power, the formal power, is with the father or the husband, unless there's not one, and then it is with the woman or the widow. And then there's a hierarchy. The wife would be under him, the children under them. And this sort of models how power is distributed in this community. So you have, at the very top, the king, and then you have the viceroy, who's like the king in the colonies, and it goes down in Texas, you had a royal governor. You have within the church, the Catholic Church in the area, you have the men who have the formal power, the priest, or you can look at the missions with the missionaries. And you don't even have nuns in this area. There was not a convent in San Antonio. There were convents in Mexico. There's even a convent in New Orleans, but not in the San Antonio area. But that doesn't mean that women did not exercise informal power within the church. In fact, I'll go ahead and mention this here because I wanted to say something about it. Religion and spirituality is really central to these women's lives. So, again, if we look at that formal structure, we're going to see the men. If you look below the surface, you're going to see the women doing a lot of the work of the church. They're members of the cofradías, or the confraternities that planned festivals and feasts for saints. They could, and they were members, many of them, of the Third Order of St. Francis. And I see this in wills because a lot of the women, well, they mention they're a member of the Third Order of St. Francis, and they request to be buried in a brown robe like that of St. Francis. So these religious societies, they're open to men and women participate in very large numbers. And then the other place you see this, besides in the document of the will, is in their households. So women are considered the spiritual leaders of their household. Again, this isn't like a formal role that's given to them. This isn't political power within the community, but it's power nonetheless. Women had altars in their homes. So there'd be a place in their home where there was an altar with paintings, with statues, and these items were considered, sometimes men owned these things as well, but I think we see them much more commonly, or many more of them amongst women. They were passed down from mother to daughter, and some of those are still in families today. So as spiritual heads of the households, as those who maintained the family altar, women played that very important role. So I was saying that these households are patriarchal households. Besides the family, the immediate family in these households, there were other people often in the household. There were sometimes servants. There were a few households in Behar that had slaves of African descent, though slavery is not as common in this area as it would be in other places throughout New Spain. You had orphans in many cases. If you think about those mortality rates, there's high rates of orphanhood. Children whose parents have have been killed or who have died. And what we see are that family members, godparents, neighbors, friends will take in orphans and adopt them. And this is very common. There's sort of some debates when people are looking at some of the documents and somebody's listed as an orphan who is adopted. Sometimes people would say, oh, maybe it's an illegitimate child of this person. I mean, we can never know for sure. That's a possibility. In some cases, we can completely disprove it because, you know, we can find the age of the person who supposedly had a child, a woman in particular, and say that, you know, she was not having children at that age. Or, in many cases, illegitimate children are listed in wills as natural children, hijos naturales. What you have in Spanish society, but in the frontier areas in particular, you have different ideas about legitimacy. So if a couple who could be married, but they haven't been married by the church yet, has a child, and they get married later, the child becomes legitimate. And there's not that shame attached there. It's not, to make a reference again to the British colonies, like the Scarlet Letter. Right? It's not that idea necessarily. Now, if adultery was involved or the man was a priest, it doesn't work that way. Then the child's illegitimate and cannot be legitimated by marriage. Different situation. But I think it's remarkable when we look at these households and think about the challenges that they face, that we see the community taking in people who needed help. I mean, this is how the community adapts and survives, and that's an important part of this story. The other part of it are these servants, Indians in particular, who are in the households. They're often called criados, from the Spanish verb criar, to grow or to raise. And what's happened, certainly by the mid-1700s, you have Plains Indian groups, especially the Comanches, who are part of this really big captive trade on the plains. So they raid other Indian groups, Spanish settlements as well, and they take captives. And those captives tend to be women and children. Oftentimes, Comanches might raid into New Mexico and take some Pueblo Indians or maybe Navajos captive. And then they'll come over to the San Antonio area, and they will offer these captives for what the Spanish called rescate, or rescue. So the Spanish would pay a fee to rescue these people. And these, primarily women and children, would be brought into Spanish households, and they would be raised in Spanish ways. They would be taught Spanish, Catholicism, and they generally worked in the households as servants. And, you know, as far as we can tell, the range of their experiences vary dramatically from being, you know, incorporated into families and being given property and wills to being treated, you know, more like slaves or women facing sexual exploitation. So there's this whole range of experience, but it's important to think about when we think about the interactions between Indians and Spanish in this community. Because if you're bringing, especially women, the children might be very, very young, but if you're bringing women into households and having them do some of that labor, especially in the kitchen, they're, of course, influencing foodways. They're bringing their own culture into the household, and there's going to be that mixing there. Honestly, there's a lot more research on that, on the criados in New Mexico, than there has been on San Antonio, but there's certainly evidence of it. If you are interested in that, you can look at the baptismal records of San Fernando, which the San Antonio Public Library has those books. And if you flip through, just sort of browse through them, you'll see quite a few young children in particular who are being baptized. It lists their godparents, and sometimes then, this can be very difficult, you can sort of trace the family and find out if they remained in that household or not. So those households, it's broader than just the family, is part of the point I wanted to make there. Let's see how I'm doing here.
Yeah, we're fine. We're really enjoying this. Stay as long as you like.
Okay. Well,
Really?
I want to leave time for questions for sure, because I can't cover everything here. I want to return to this idea of economic roles, the roles that women played in this very small economy. So San Antonio, the economy does not grow quickly. as you can imagine, it's very far from other markets. So most of the Coahuila at times, also to Louisiana, legally when Louisiana is Spanish, and sometimes illegally when it's not, because there was a lot of illicit trade between Spanish Texas and French Louisiana. Between that, Los Adais and Natchitoches are very close together, and there was a lot of interaction there. You have some merchants who will travel to Coahuila. Saltillo has an annual trade fair until, actually, you're pointing to the Arredondo book. Arredondo moved it away from Saltillo, and people were very upset. But throughout most of the colonial period, there's an annual trade fair in Saltillo. In San Antonio, people in San Antonio have a lot of connections to people in Saltillo. But besides that, there's not a lot of space for this economy to develop. So what you have, largely barter trade. You'll see in some of the documents, the wills in particular, people will list their debts. And oftentimes the debts are not monetary figures. They didn't borrow money in a dollar amount or lend money in a dollar amount. They do sometimes, but more often than not, they're lending cattle to somebody to get their ranching started or to help them out, or other type of items that were of value to these households. And it's in this informal economy that's really critical to the survival of these people on the frontier who are far from markets that women play an important role. So in these wills, I find a lot of women, those who have some property, some capital, because it's scarce, loaning items to families, friends, neighbors. They're not merchants. When you see the merchants, you can tell. They're talking about just the things they say they own, a huge amount of tallow, for example, or something that they're going to take to another market and sell. What we're talking about here is much smaller in scale, but nonetheless, it's this role that's really critical until maybe the 1820s or so. That's when you start to see a change. And I think it's not a coincidence that in the 1820s, you have Texas opened up to colonization, and you have a lot of Europeans and Anglo-Americans, but initially you see individual European men coming into San Antonio, marrying into some of the families, and the economy starts to change. And I think you have to wonder, as the economy matures, how does that shift impact women? In fact, I think some of these men who come in and aren't accustomed to these type of economic roles for women are less likely to engage in the economy with them. The other thing that we see are women who are ranchers. So there's a few in particular. One I write about quite a bit is Maria Calvillo. Is anybody familiar with Maria Calvillo? She owned the Rancho de las Cabras, and actually some other pieces of land. Las Cabras was Mission Espada's ranch, and her father started to lease some land in the area in the late 1700s, and then with the secularization of the missions, so when they're made regular parishes, that land is distributed, and he gets title to a big piece of the Rancho de las Cabras. Another family got another piece of it. And in 1814, right after the Battle of Medina, when Indian attacks, I keep pointing at you, Dan, when I say Battle of Medina, but whenever I think of it, I think of you. But one of the things we see in the aftermath of the Battle of Medina are increased Indian raids, especially on these outlying ranches. But her father, Ignacio Calvillo, and his wife, and Maria Calvillo and some other workers were on the Rancho de las Cabras in 1814 when there was a Lipan Apache raid. And then some of the witnesses said also that his grandson was involved in it, so he was working with these Indians. But he was killed in this raid. She was the eldest surviving child of the Calvillos, and she inherited that ranch. And she ran that ranch, and it's really large. The piece of land is very large, until the 1840s. She dies in the early 1850s. She lived a very long life. She was in her 80s. In the 1840s, she sells that ranch to, I think his first name is Edward Dwyer, he was a mayor of San Antonio, but he was collecting a lot of land in the area. And then some other things happened for her. I'm sort of getting into a different story, though it's very interesting. But she was declared by the court as non-compos. Operated this massive ranch. She filed for land titles because in the attacker stole a chest that had the papers to the ranch. So she had to refile to get those papers, and she petitioned to get more land. So she's just one example of what women could do and did do in this system. Another one in the 1770s, Mariana Corbelo was the second largest cattle owner in Behar. If you look at the Bear archives, have the brands, the recorded brands for the area. Branding was quite inconsistent, but by the late 1700s, it was required. There were regular roundups, and all of the feral cattle were branded. And there were a lot of contests over who those cattle belonged to, as you can imagine. But if you look through those records, you'll see women popping up. And they're not, I don't want to overstate this, they're not near as common as men. But nonetheless, you'll see women, and there's one woman, I think her last name is Ureña. She had like 6 cattle brands. So what's happening, it's probably through inheritance, right? There's different ranches with different brands, and they're ending up in the hands of a survivor in many ways. So that, going through the wills, there are many other women who own ranches as well. So in that sense, women are playing an important economic role as property owners, as ranchers in the area. They also help their husbands with their businesses. There were some men who had shops in their homes, and the women worked in those shops, and when their husbands traveled or died, they ran those shops. So I think there's many ways we can see this economic participation. The last thing I want to mention quickly, and then I sort of want to go through an example of a will with you all, and then I'll stop, is material culture, what people owned, what their homes looked like. By our standards, they're very sparsely furnished homes, yet what they have is also quite remarkable, I think. So the homes tend to be these jacales. They're made out of sticks and straw. They're very impermanent structures, but over time, families start to build these stone houses. So they become bigger, they become more permanent. Inside those homes, women owned the kitchenwares, and they're very specific when they describe these in their wills. The pots, the comales, the griddles, the metates and manos, all of these items that were important in women's work, they would pass on to their daughters. Clothing, there's very few changes of clothing listed in the wills. There are the religious items that I mentioned before, the furniture, a table, a few chairs, maybe. Metal was scarce on the frontier, so the furniture is generally made without nails, and they fit together perfectly. It's amazing to see. Some families have beds, but not everybody has beds. A lot of chests, especially the ones that have legs and they're off the ground to protect them. Sometimes these chests have a lock and key that go with them. Sometimes they say where they're from. These chests from Michoacan were very common. There's some jewelry. These are luxury items. They tend to be rare. But if women own jewelry, they're definitely going to list that in their wills. Books are less common. What else? Tools for the household and arms as well. So if a family, and these are generally, when we talk about the arms, considered men's possessions. Sometimes women list them, but often these are things that are passed from fathers to sons. So they'll list the types of the escopetas, the shotguns, if they're presidial soldiers, some of their equipment that they might have. The people on the frontiers talk about how they do not have enough to protect themselves from Indians, and I would say, based on the wills and inventories, that certainly seems to be the case. They do not have enough. So these households don't have much, Yet, if you can trace where some of these items came from, I think it's quite remarkable. And archaeology gives us some of this information as well. But some of these households, some of these ranches had china, from China. If you think about, so we're way out on the frontier, but if we pull back and think about the broad Spanish Empire, a lot of the silver from the silver mines is making its way to China. Once Spain has control of the Philippines, they can stop off at that port, make their way to China, and they get items. They get silks, they get porcelain, and they bring that back. And some of it makes it all the way to the San Antonio area. So while they're sparsely furnished, you see the connections, Spain's place in the world. All right, so I wanted to give y'all an example of a will, and this is a will that I translated for my book. There's only a few that I fully translated because it takes a lot of time, and many of the documents are not perfectly preserved. There are pieces missing or torn or illegible, so I picked the ones that were the best. But this is a will from Juana de Hoyos, who in 1785 recorded her will in San Fernando de Bejar. And I just want to go through a document to show you what I work with, but also show you how I interpret it. So San Antonio, there's not a lot of surviving wills, but in this Saltillo area, that's another place I did research, I had hundreds of wills. So I've read through hundreds of these, so I feel fairly comfortable pointing out these patterns. She begins, "In the name of God, all-powerful, and the Holy Virgin Mary, Queen of Heaven, Amen. Know all who read this writing of my last will and testament that I, Juana de Hoyos, native of Coahuila and citizen of San Fernando in the province of Texas, was married according to the rites of our Holy Mother the Church with Andres Hernandez, now deceased." All of the wills start off with a brief prayer. There's a formula for these that's followed. And it also is really important in establishing this isn't just about their property and passing things on. This is also very much a spiritual document. She's from Coahuila, which is pretty common. We see many people moving to this area from places that were once the frontier, right, the northern parts of New Spain. And she notes that she had been married and that she's widowed. Again, a common experience. During our marriage, we had 5 boys, of which 1 died without an heir, and 2 daughters. And she names those children. So, again, women or adults, it's quite common for them to lose children. And we see that here. It's important that she notes that the one son died without an heir because that heir would have become an heir of hers. She says, "I am healthy and in my sound judgment, memory, and understanding, but because I'm about to travel to lands far away and I fear death, as I am advanced in age, I do not want to be caught unprepared for that necessary journey." This is the motive for writing the will. She's about to travel, which is always dangerous, and she's in advanced age, so she wants to make sure she has everything in place. She then says, "I believe in all the mysteries of our Catholic religion, in whose faith I have lived and wish to die, and thus I order my last testament in the following form." That's a common statement as well, as is this next one. "First, from this hour until the arrival of my death, I send my soul to God who created it and redeemed it with the blood of his holy Son. Send my body to the earth from where it was formed, and bury it in a sacred place according to the holy rites of the church." So this idea of send my soul to heaven and my body back to the earth, a statement, and it's often worded in different ways, but it's very common in the wills. What she doesn't do, that many people do in their wills, is say exactly where she wants to be buried. So what would be common would be in the floor of a church. They didn't use coffins, generally. And they would often say, "I'd like to be as close to the main altar as possible," or near this chapel, or near this statue that might have been important to them. San Antonio, by the I think it's the early 1800s, there's an edict from the viceroy that says people have to be buried in cemeteries, in the Campo Santo. We can't keep burying people in the floors of churches because there was fear of disease. In New Mexico, I can tell you that was totally ignored. So those burials continue. In San Antonio, though, they do start to bury more people in the Campo Santo. So by the 1800s, you do have some people requesting to be buried there. Second, I declare as my property a stone house with a thatched roof, which is my home on the corner of the Plaza de Armas of this presidio on the south side toward the west. It's a little less than 12 varas along 2 solares next to it, which are together as one. And she says the measurements, boundaries, and possessions are in the documents. So that house made of stone, that indicates it's a bit more valuable. The amount of land she has, a vara is a very small, it's not very much, but the 2 solares, the solar is a town lot. So the fact that she has 2 together, that's a good amount of land in town. And that's likely where she lives. Also the Plaza de Armas, a really central location, indicates, and in fact, I've talked about this woman before and people have told me they're in her family line. She has connections to Canary Islanders, which would make sense. Third, I declare for my property a day of water, 24 hours, and the labor de abajo, with the suertes of land that correspond to it. So she has another piece of land that she probably uses or can be used for agriculture, and it has water rights attached to it. Again, something the Canary Islanders were given, the Presidio soldiers asked for, and were given much later. But this indicates value as well. Many people later received land, it had no water attached to it, and they had to buy water rights or rent it from other people. Fourth, I declare as my property the part of the ranch of San Bartolome that my deceased husband and I acquired during our marriage. According to the clause in his will, it's 6 leagues of land with the boundaries as described in his papers. My husband's siblings also have an interest in the land which is described in his will. So she's a rancher. She understands the community property. This was something they acquired together, so her interest in it is probably half of that ranch. It's a little bit unclear if her husband, and I don't have his will, if he left his half of the ranch or part of his half to his siblings and that's why they have an interest, or if they all bought it together. But nonetheless, she is clearly stating she understands these property rights here. Fifth, I declare as my movable property the cattle that are found with my brand and sign in the said ranch, as well as those in the summer pasture of this town. Also, I have tame broncos and a branding iron. So, again, saying she's a rancher, she has her own brand, which indicates a certain level of being a rancher, I suppose. Tame broncos, that sounds like an oxymoron. I think they were broncos that were broken, or that were tamed. And she talks about where they're located or should be located, right? Without the fences, it's going to be a problem. But if there's an inventory, they will try to account for all of those cattle. Sixth, it is my wish that the best of my said property from this time be maintained in order to pay for the expenses of my funeral and burial. Mandatory bequest honors and masses on the anniversary of my death. So what she's doing here is saying that, after the inventory, make sure that my funeral is covered. All of these things that would ensure that her soul makes it to heaven. Again, sort of reinforcing the idea that this is also about her spirituality, right? Her life after death, so to speak. Seventh, I declare that I name as my only universal and legitimate heirs to my property as declared in the previous clauses, my sons and daughters, Francisco, Placido, Miguel, Jose Andres, Ignacia, and Manuela, so that they may have and enjoy it for themselves and their legitimate heirs with the blessing of God and myself. This should only be carried out after my death. And then she says, during my life, I reserve the right to the declared property to use freely as I wish if the need occurs. Just being very careful here. This language is somewhat common, but not everybody says that. So what we have here, she doesn't say how it should be divided. And in not saying that, that means it'll be divided equally amongst these heirs. That's what the Spanish law indicates. So if there's not a counter indication to that, that's the way it would happen. And then she goes on here, and in order to deposit my said property when the day of my death comes and to care for it and so that my children can enjoy it, I name as my executor of my last will and testament my son Placido Hernandez, to whom I give all of my power and faculty as the law requires. During my life, he may conserve and care for all the referred to property so that he and his siblings may enjoy it quietly and peacefully. After my death, he should inventory my estate and divide the property between his siblings in a just manner according to the law. This is a little bit confusing here. I think because she's traveling, she's giving him power before she dies. But as she mentioned earlier, if she needs that property though, it's hers and she's gonna go back and take it. This I order thus to excuse my poor heirs. 7 witnesses, who in this case and other cases are prescribed by law, have signed below. Beside the witnesses, Don Juan Jose Montes has signed for me since I do not know how to sign. So again, we have that common statement there. That's common amongst men and women. And the witnesses who signed the will so that it can be a documented will and be in full force. So sometimes these documents are lost, and witnesses will be called into court to reconstruct the will, and then that will become a valid will. You can imagine that might be sort of problematic with people's memories, but nonetheless, that happened in many cases as well. So I think that gives you an idea of the research that I do, how I analyze those documents, and sort of the experiences of some of these very early women in the San Antonio or Bear community who faced very challenging circumstances, I think, but were able to be very creative and adapt and help the community to survive and to grow. So I'll go ahead and stop there, and I'll take questions. Dan?
Will you be speaking at the Battle of Medina Symposium?
I don't know. I don't think so.
Oh, not this year?
No,
Oh, we're gonna miss you.
I know. Well, I don't believe that Barbara asked me to this time.
I'll check with you.
Okay, I mean, I don't need to. I'm happy. I talked to her. I know she said that they were talking about having fewer speakers and giving them more time or something, because last time I think it went on so long. So I'm happy to let other people.
Oh, good.
Speak.
And one of the Hoyos was married to Andres, and he was my uncle.
Oh,
15 generations ago.
wow.
Neat.
See, this is. That's
Like
wonderful.
you said.
It's available on Amazon. I think it's Texas Tech University Press published it, so you can always buy it through the publisher. I brought a copy I can leave with you all. I didn't know if you all have a library or some repository, but
We got a library right there.
I'll sign it. I can leave it with y'all, and you can pass it around. Now my book, I should say, it's broader. It's not just San Antonio. So I talk about New Mexico, El Paso. In El Paso, in this case, it's El Paso del Norte. That's today Ciudad Juarez. That was what El Paso used to be.
Take
in
your
Saltillo.
phone and take a picture of the ISBN. Scan it with take a picture of it with your phone. You can look it up and order a copy.
Yeah, me too.
Scan it.
My kids can help me order stuff.
I have, I did write a brief essay in the book that Dan has, that he contributed to as well, the Tricentennial book. And I talked specifically about women and children in early San Antonio. And I wrote a very brief blurb on the Rancho de los Caudas.
Lost in my car somewhere.
And I wrote an essay on Maria Calvillo that's going to be out hopefully in a few months in a book on women ranchers in Texas that spans a broad period of time. But I'm happy to say that Tejanas will be included in it as well. That's going to be Texas A&M Press.
I wondered why one of my great-grandmothers started buying property in her name instead of her husband's name. He first bought it in his name, and after he married her, all the property was bought in her name.
Interesting. Yeah, I think for women, well, I mean, if it's Spanish law and it's bought while they're married, it should belong to them equally. But we do see some changes in those laws.
Well, I wondered, I thought it was because he maybe was married before to somebody else, and maybe that person wasn't dead.
Right.
That's what I thought. But maybe that wasn't it at all. Maybe that wasn't.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's some people, I mean, if you look at
Here, let me make a copy of it.
some of the, like the Kennedy, Mifflin Kennedy, he does some funny things. You know, if you have enough power and money, you don't have to necessarily abide by all the laws. But what he did, he got some family members to sign over land to him.
Who's this?
Mifflin Kennedy.
Oh, the
'cause they're-
Kennedy, the King Ranch.
Right.
Oh.
So there's always exceptions to the
Oh.
laws, but because when we're talking about the King Ranch stuff and the Kennedys, to get that much property, there's something different going on.
No,
Yes.
he bought it.
Yes.
What level of records from San Antonio this era would have gotten all the way back to Spain? I know they sent things having to do with the Spanish governors. In Sevilla, they got the whole library.
Right, yeah, in Sevilla, the archives of the Indies have a lot of documents that relate to Spain,
Just put it on the
I mean,
back
to
of
Texas, but in general, they tend to be policies, government edicts, those type of things.
Email it to
So
me.
from my research, that wasn't as important. I mean, there's things like, there's policies that were issued and that were enacted that would impact women and children in daily lives. But as far as property records, the wills, the type of records I like to use, there's a good cross-section of them that stayed local in the Bear archives.
But things like a census report, would that be, make it all the way back to Spain?
It would. There's supposed to be copies that go back, but we have copies here too. They're sent to the governor. So the problem though with the Bear archives is that some of the Bear archives are here in San Antonio, not here, but in the county courthouse, across from the county courthouse now. And then some of them are in Austin at UT. And those are the ones being translated. So a lot of the land records and the wills are at the county, and then many of the other documents are at UT. So you have to sort of sort through that.
Are they gone now? How far back?
Are they, I'm sorry,
How far back have they gone now?
with the translations? They started at the beginning, and they're moving forward in time, so they're somewhere in the 1790s. I think they might be right around 1790. So it's hard, I know when I was looking for things on Battle of Medina and women, those documents haven't been translated. So you need to go to Austin, and then because of Arredondo and the Spanish Royalist Army, there's things in Mexico, there's things in Spain as well.
The Dwyer name you mentioned a while ago, was that down at Floresville? Or at, not Lower, but Greytown?
It's that area, it's right by Floresville. I think it's currently outside of Floresville, but it's right by it.
Well, because he is connected with my daughter. I'm trying to think. Some kin.
He bought a lot of land in different places in the whole area, and he bought that piece of the Rancho de los Cabros. And his wife was a descendant of a Canary Islander.
Okay, you remember her name?
No, but I can find it.
Well, okay, I'm thinking it's my daughter's family.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Leos and Corrals.
Mm-hmm. I think that's,
I think
Yes.
that's one of those, that's what I'm saying. But a lot of times I can't find enough proof of him to get it straight in my mind, what he was to
I think
her.
she outlived him as well, so I think she might have ended up with the property. But after the Dwyers, it changed hands many, many times. And then it ended up with a family who gave it to the state,
Mhm.
and then the state gave it to the National Park Service, and it's actually,
Yeah.
you know, it's connected to Mission Espada, and it's part of the World Heritage Site now,
That's
which
good.
is pretty cool that that longtime woman-owned ranch is part of the World Heritage Site.
We enjoyed it so much.
In the records for the women, would you actually come across the brands that they had?
No, I mean, not in their wills, nor in inventories. I mean, they mention the brands, but they don't describe them. But there are documents in the Bear archives where there's inventories of brands.
Okay.
Because, I mean,
They actually still keep the
right,
book.
I don't know how accurate, I don't know if they were all of the brands, I'm sure they're not.
They had a couple here, this is one, Mission de la Espada. Those are four.
Well, the reason I asked is I came
I
across a
have
couple of
some
these
too.
old brands,
The
down where I got,
brands.
and it's like, how do you find out who's in where?
If you all aren't familiar with the book called Los Misteños by Jack Jackson, he has in the appendices of his book some of the brands.
9741.
So, big book, that's very helpful for those of us interested in ranching in this area.
So was this topic the one that you did your dissertation on as well?
Yes.
Okay. And that was
Oh,
with
this is-
Southern Methodist?
Yes. I studied with David Weber, who was a very prolific historian of the Spanish borderlands.
My daughter lives in Richardson.
I
But the
grew
one
up in
that,
Richardson.
one that's descendant of the Canary Island, she lives in Richardson.
I went to Berkner High School, right there in Richardson, so.
Yeah.
Where
Well,
I grew up.
my grandchildren did too, and then my daughter had to move up to, well, Pennsylvania, New Jersey.
Oh, okay.
But she'll be down tomorrow. She was supposed to come tonight, and she changed her mind. They're coming down tomorrow night. And I've only been trying to get her here 30 years.
Okay.
30 years. And I thought, oh boy, tonight she'll come, you know. She was coming tonight, but they changed their plans. They're coming tomorrow night.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. And so,
Do you know what triggers, then, what kind of fine does it take for them to say something's an archaeological site? You mentioned that earlier. Here's why I'm asking, because I've got all the Indian artifacts I found on the property that I
Can you
bought.
send it
And I
again?
want somebody else telling me what to do with my property.
Right.
So it's like, do you want to share what you found, or do you?
Right. Well, you know, I talked to, so the archaeologist, one of the archaeologists who's worked on this Richard Bean site, he's with Texas A&M College Station. And he said, like, he's not really interested in other sites nearby because what they have is so rich. So what he said, the reason it's so valuable is because of the site on the Medina River. When you have a river, you just have so many people using that water over time. And then there's something, and I don't really know what I'm talking about here, but with the sediment from the river, that makes it really interesting and maybe easier to date things. So I think there's places that have a lot of artifacts, but archaeologists might not be interested in going to those. So, and they like to go to the same place for a long time.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm interested in archaeology, but I don't know enough about it.
I am too. So if you ever have a dig that you do know about and need helpers, I do know how to help.
okay.
I was able to help with a dig at the mission a couple of years ago when they just became World Heritage Site.
That's
It was
great.
really interesting. We didn't find anything, but
Oh,
it was
okay.
still fun.
Okay.
Is Southern-
Just learning it.
Is Southern Texas Archaeological Bunch still working, or?
I don't know if it was that group. There was a young lady that I think she did a Facebook post, and that's how I found out about the search. And she needed help during the summer for her dissertation.
That's great.
talking to you. But then
I'm surprised
you know,
that
Kay-
women
Kay
have a
is
voice
from
more.
this area. You
Yeah.
know, Kay,
I
I
didn't
heard
think
like
there
her
was
ancestors.
women.
They used to call her where we grew up.